May 21, 1992. Studio One at NBC Burbank. The cameras had been rolling for 30 years, and on this particular Thursday night, the red tally light blinked on as it had 11,000 times before. The audience settled into their seats with the practiced anticipation of ritual. Johnny Carson walked to his mark, adjusted his cuffs, and prepared to deliver what would become the most memorable silence in American television history. The studio was precisely 72 degrees, as it always was. The applause sign glowed amber in the shadows above stage left. But something in the room felt different. A heaviness that production assistants would later struggle to articulate, a quality of attention that went beyond the usual electricity of live broadcast. For 3 decades, The Tonight Show had functioned as America's living room, the place where the nation gathered after the day's tensions dissolved into laughter. Carson had become more than an entertainer. He had evolved into a kind of national therapist, the voice that told America it was okay to go to bed, that tomorrow would come with its own rhythms and possibilities. His desk, that famous curved oak surface positioned at a precise 45-degree angle to camera 2, had become a symbol of constancy in a nation that had survived Vietnam, Watergate, economic collapse, and the slow erosion of consensus reality. To sit across from Johnny Carson was to be baptized into American celebrity. To make him laugh was to receive validation from the culture itself. But to witness Johnny Carson fall silent, to watch that perpetual machinery of wit and deflection simply stop, that was something else entirely. The guest that evening was Dr. Carl Sagan, the Cornell astrophysicist who had become, somewhat improbably, one of Carson's recurring favorites. Sagan had appeared on The Tonight Show 26 times over the years, more than almost any other scientist in the program's history. Carson, who had studied physics before switching to drama at the University of Nebraska, felt a genuine kinship with Sagan's ability to make the cosmos comprehensible without diminishing its wonder. Their conversations had always possessed a quality of authentic curiosity, moments when the performance aspect of late-night television fell away and 2 intelligent men simply explored ideas together while 12 million people listened in. But this appearance was different. Sagan had not come to discuss the rings of Saturn or the possibility of extraterrestrial life. He had come to talk about something closer to home, something that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats and caused Carson's usual repertoire of facial expressions, that vast vocabulary of eyebrow raises and knowing smirks, to dissolve into something rawer and less protected. The topic was nuclear winter. Sagan had spent the previous year working with a team of atmospheric scientists, running computer models that calculated what would happen to Earth's climate in the aftermath of a large-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. The findings were catastrophic. Even a limited nuclear war would inject so much smoke and debris into the stratosphere that sunlight would be blocked for months, perhaps years. Temperatures would plummet. Agriculture would collapse. The survivors of the initial blasts would face mass starvation in a frozen, darkened world. It was not speculation. It was applied physics. The same principles that governed weather systems and planetary atmospheres simply extrapolated to account for unprecedented amounts of particulate matter in the upper atmosphere.
Carson listened. The audience listened. The cameras continued their slow push-in, tightening on Carson's face as Sagan spoke with his characteristic mix of precision and barely contained urgency. There were no jokes, no commercial break banter, no pivot to a lighter subject. Carson's hands, which usually gestured constantly, reaching for pens, adjusting note cards, drumming silent rhythms on the desktop, went still. His fingers rested flat against the oak surface, and he did not move them. What was unfolding was not entertainment. It was something American television had been carefully designed to avoid: unmediated reality, presented without the protective buffer of irony or the escape hatch of humor. The Tonight Show had always been a masterclass in tone management, a nightly demonstration of how to discuss serious subjects while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for a nation to sleep peacefully. Carson could interview politicians without becoming political, could acknowledge tragedy without succumbing to despair, could touch on controversy while keeping the atmosphere light enough that sponsors remained comfortable. It was a high-wire act of emotional regulation performed 5 nights a week for 3 decades. But nuclear winter was not a subject that permitted deflection. Sagan was describing the end of civilization, and he was doing so with the calm authority of someone presenting a weather forecast. The models were clear. The physics was settled. If the missiles flew, the world would freeze. Carson did not interrupt. He did not offer a quip to relieve the tension. He did not glance at his notes or signal to the director for a break. He simply listened, his face gradually emptying of expression until what remained was something the audience had rarely seen: fear, undisguised and unmanaged. When Sagan finished, the studio was silent. The applause sign remained dark. Carson looked down at his desk, that symbol of authority and control, the physical manifestation of his 3-decade reign over American popular culture, and for a moment seemed uncertain of what to do next. His hands remained flat against the oak surface. The red tally light on camera 2 continued its unblinking stare. Then Carson spoke, and his voice carried none of its usual performance qualities. No timing, no calibration, just a simple, direct question that cut through decades of professional polish. What do we do? It was not a rhetorical question. It was not set up for a punchline. It was an actual request for information from a man who had just realized that his fame, his influence, his 3 decades of cultural authority meant nothing in the face of atmospheric physics. Sagan's answer was methodical and practical: public pressure, arms control treaties, international cooperation, education. But the moment had already occurred. The silence had already happened. America had watched Johnny Carson, the man who made everything bearable, who could find humor in any situation, who had guided the nation through assassinations and scandals and economic collapse with his preternatural ability to maintain perspective, run out of jokes. The episode aired as recorded. NBC received thousands of calls. Some viewers were angry, feeling that Carson had violated the implicit contract of late-night television by allowing such unfiltered grimness into their homes. Others were grateful, sensing that they had witnessed something rare: a public figure dropping his persona entirely and responding to information as a human being rather than as an entertainer. The segment was replayed on news programs. Clips circulated in physics departments and peace organizations. Sagan later said it generated more response than any other appearance he had made in his career.
But what mattered was not the public reaction. What mattered was the 10 seconds of silence before Carson asked his question. What mattered was watching a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of emotional management simply stop performing and sit with the reality of what he was hearing. The applause sign, glowing amber in the shadows, waited for a cue that never came. Carson's desk had always functioned as more than furniture. It was a psychological boundary, a physical marker that separated the performance space from the audience's world. Guests approached it as supplicants, hoping to be granted entry into Carson's good graces and, by extension, into America's approval. The desk represented control over timing, over tone, over the emotional temperature of the room. It was the command center from which Carson orchestrated an elaborate nightly ritual of controlled spontaneity, making carefully scripted moments feel genuinely unrehearsed and genuinely dangerous moments feel safely contained. But on that May evening in 1992, the desk became something else. It became the surface upon which Carson's hands rested, motionless, while he absorbed information he could not joke about. It became a symbol of the limits of performance, the point at which even the most skilled practitioner of emotional deflection confronts material that refuses to be managed or softened or made palatable for mass consumption. The cultural power Carson wielded was not political in any conventional sense. He had always maintained a studied neutrality on partisan issues, understanding that his influence depended on not alienating half his audience. But his power was real nonetheless. He could make or destroy careers with a gesture. He could shape public perception of politicians, artists, and ideas through the simple act of deciding who sat in the guest chair and how seriously he treated them. For 3 decades, he had functioned as a gatekeeper, determining what entered the American consciousness and what remained marginal. Yet that power was ultimately performative. It depended on Carson maintaining his role as the unflappable host, the man who could put anything into perspective, who could find the angle that made every subject accessible without being simplistic, entertaining without being trivial. The moment Carson stopped performing, the moment his hands went still on the desk and his face emptied of its professional animation, the power evaporated. What remained was simply a 66-year-old man in a studio in Burbank, listening to a scientist describe the end of the world. The television industry had spent 40 years developing elaborate mechanisms for managing the emotional experience of mass audiences. Networks understood that viewers needed to feel engaged but not overwhelmed, informed but not depressed, connected to current events but not implicated in their consequences. The Tonight Show was perhaps the most sophisticated expression of this emotional management, a nightly demonstration of how to acknowledge the darkness while keeping the lights on, how to touch on serious subjects while maintaining the atmosphere of a party that would continue indefinitely. Nuclear winter could not be managed in this way. It was not a subject that permitted the usual dance of engagement and deflection. It was binary. Either the missiles flew and civilization ended, or they didn't. There was no middle ground, no compromise position, no way to split the difference between annihilation and survival. Sagan's models had eliminated the space where Carson usually operated, that carefully maintained zone where everything was serious but nothing was desperate, where everything mattered but nothing was unrecoverable.
This silence after Sagan finished speaking was not dead air. It was the sound of a mechanism failing, of the emotional management system encountering material it could not process. The audience waited for Carson to do what he always did: find the angle, locate the perspective, deliver the line that would allow everyone to breathe again. But Carson didn't deliver the line. He sat with the silence, and in doing so, forced the audience to sit with it as well. What made the moment culturally significant was not its content, but its context. Americans had heard about nuclear weapons before. They had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the duck and cover drills, the constant background hum of Cold War anxiety. But that anxiety had always been managed, contained within specific cultural spaces: news programs, political debates, disaster films that carried implicit warning labels. The Tonight Show was supposed to be the place you went to escape that anxiety, to remember that life continued, that laughter was possible, that tomorrow would arrive with its familiar rhythms. By allowing the silence to persist, by sitting with Sagan's information without immediately reaching for the tools of his trade, Carson violated that implicit contract. He let the anxiety into the protected space. He acknowledged that some realities cannot be managed or deflected or made bearable through humor. And in doing so, he gave the audience permission to stop pretending that everything was under control. The epilogue to this moment unfolded slowly, across years rather than hours. Carson retired from The Tonight Show 7 weeks later, on May 22, 1992. 1 day after the Sagan appearance. It would be simplistic to claim a direct causal relationship, but the timing was notable. Carson had spent 30 years maintaining the performance, keeping the machinery running, ensuring that America could go to bed confident that someone was managing the emotional temperature of the culture. The nuclear winter conversation had revealed the limits of that role, the point at which even the most skilled performer confronts realities that refuse to cooperate with the requirements of entertainment. The applause sign, that glowing amber symbol that had cued millions of audience responses over 3 decades, was donated to the Smithsonian after Carson's final broadcast. It sits now in a climate-controlled storage facility, an artifact of a particular mode of cultural production, the nightly ritual of managed spontaneity, the carefully orchestrated appearance of genuine connection between performer and audience, the elaborate machinery designed to make people feel informed and entertained and reassured all at once. But on that Thursday in May 1992, the sign stayed dark. Carson's hands remained still on the oak surface of his desk, and for 10 seconds, American television simply stopped performing and allowed itself to register something true, that the world contains realities larger and more consequential than any individual's ability to manage them, that authority has limits, that sometimes the only honest response is silence. The red tally light blinked off. The audience filed out into the Burbank night, and somewhere in the distance, the applause sign waited, patient, mechanical, ready for a cue that had already passed into history.